In the darkest corners of the market square, where desperation transformed human dignity into commodity and survival required abandoning every principle that defined civilized society, there existed stalls that traded in lives rather than goods, places where the unwanted, the broken, and the discarded were displayed like damaged merchandise seeking buyers whose purposes ranged from labor to entertain. It meant to simple ownership of beings whose worth had been reduced to whatever someone was willing to pay. Elowen stood among such offerings on a morning when autumn rain made the cobblestones slick with water that reflected the gray sky like tears the world was too tired to shed. 20 years old and bearing the invisible scars that marked those who had learned to survive through absolute silence, she possessed the kind of stillness that came from understanding that movement might attract attention she couldn't afford. That voice might reveal opinions no one wanted to hear from someone whose value had been determined by others. According to criteria, she had never been alone. Wed to influence. The rough burlap sack that covered her head served multiple purposes for the traders who had acquired her services through methods they preferred not to discuss in detail. It prevented potential buyers from assessing her appearance before negotiations were complete, avoiding complications that might arise if her features proved either too attractive or too damaged for their intended purposes. More importantly, it concealed eyes that had been described as unsettling by those who had encountered her gaze directly, as though she could see beyond surface appearances to truths that others preferred to keep hidden. Around her, other unfortunates waited in various states of resignation and despair, their circumstances having led them to places where freedom became theoretical concept rather than practical reality. Some had been sold by families who could no longer afford to feed them during seasons when survival required choosing which children would live through winter. Others had been captured during territorial disputes that left them without pack protection or legal status that might have prevented their reduction to property that could be transferred through simple monetary exchange. But none bore the particular combination of mystery and systematic devaluation that characterized Elowen's presentation to potential purchasers. The traders who handled her case spoke in whispers about curses and ill omens, about supernatural characteristics that made her unsuitable for traditional domestic service, while her strange effect on animals and occasional predictions about weather patterns suggested abilities that exceeded normal Omega capabilities, but remained too unreliable to be marketed as genuine spiritual services. She was an anomaly that defied easy categorization, too valuable to discard but too dangerous to promote, possessed of qualities that made experienced traders nervous, despite their familiarity with handling difficult merchandise, whose characteristics required careful management to avoid complications that could affect their business reputation or personal safety. The price they had set for her reflected their confusion about her actual worth. 2 coins, barely enough to cover the cost of feeding her for a week, suggesting either genuine belief that she possessed minimal value or desire to transfer responsibility for her care to someone else before whatever made them uncomfortable about her presence manifested in ways that could prove costly or embarrassing. 2 coins for a life that had been systematically stripped of dignity, autonomy, and recognition as anything more than burden to be transferred between owners who possessed authority to determine her future according to their convenience and financial interests. The market square bustled with ordinary commerce around the margins where such transactions occurred. Merchants selling goods that served normal domestic purposes, customers negotiating prices for items whose value could be assessed through conventional criteria, children playing games that required no understanding of the cruel mathematics that governed survival for those whose circumstances had moved beyond social protection into realms where mercy was purchased rather than granted as basic right. But occasionally, buyers approached the stalls where human dignity had been reduced to commodity status, drawn by needs or purposes that exceeded what legitimate commerce could provide. Some sought laborers whose legal status would prevent them from demanding wages or protection under territorial laws that governed employment relationships between pack members. Others wanted companions whose lack of social connections meant their treatment would remain private, rather than becoming subject to community oversight or moral judgment. And some, very occasionally, made purchases that served purposes they themselves didn't fully understand. Decisions that felt like impulse, but carried consequences that would reveal themselves only through time, and circumstances that challenged assumptions about chance, choice, and the mysterious ways that destiny operated when mortal plans intersected with forces that governed spiritual architect. Viewer of their world. Today would determine whether Elowen's systematic devaluation would continue indefinitely, or whether recognition of her actual worth would finally emerge from sources wise enough to see beyond surface appearances to underlying truth that had been hidden beneath circumstances designed to prevent its discovery. The morning held its breath around her, charged with possibility that felt both fragile and somehow inevitable, as if forces beyond ordinary understanding were gathering to demonstrate that sometimes the most profound transformations began in places where hope seemed most impossible, where dignity appeared most thoroughly destroyed, where worth had been so systematically denied that its eventual revelation would challenge everyone's assumptions about value, recognition, and the divine justice that operated according to principles deeper than market prices or human judgment. 2 coins separated her from whatever came next, but worth that transcended monetary assessment waited beneath coverings designed to hide what others had been too limited or too frightened to acknowledge appropriately. Before we begin, remember to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Every day, a new story awaits you. Now, let us begin. The morning market of Ravenhall teemed with activity that spoke of prosperity and normalcy. Merchants arranging displays that caught early sunlight, while customers moved through stalls with confidence that their needs would be met through honest commerce, conducted according to rules that protected both buyers and sellers. The scents of fresh bread and ripening fruit, mingled with sounds of negotiation and friendly conversation, that characterized communities where trade served mutual benefit rather than survival necessity that reduced dignity to commodity status. Prince Kaelin moved through these familiar scenes with practiced anonymity, wearing simple traveling clothes that allowed him to observe without the complications that came with royal recognition. At 25, he had learned to value these rare opportunities for genuine assessment of his future kingdom's daily rhythms, understanding that effective leadership required knowledge that extended beyond formal reports and ceremonial presentations, to include direct observation of how policies affected ordinary lives. His attention was caught not by the prosperous main thoroughfares where legitimate business flourished, but by the shadows at the market's periphery where transactions occurred beyond the reach of oversight that governed respectable commerce. Experience had taught him that a realm's character could be measured as much by what it allowed in its dark corners as by what it celebrated in public spaces. The slave market operated with carefully maintained discretion, positioned where those who needed its services could find them, without forcing acknowledgement from citizens, who preferred to believe such places didn't exist, within territories governed by laws that supposedly protected individual dignity and freedom. A necessary evil that served purposes ranging from punishment for criminal behavior to disposal of individuals whose circumstances had placed them beyond social protection, regulated enough to prevent the worst abuses, but tolerated because complete elimination would create problems for which no alternative solutions had been developed. Prince Kaelin approached these stalls with distaste that had been shaped by years of understanding that his future authority would require addressing contradictions between stated principles and practical realities, between ideals about human worth and systems that sometimes treated people as property, whose value could be determined through monetary exchange. "Quality merchandise today, my lord," called a trader, whose appearance suggested familiarity with customers whose needs extended beyond conventional commerce. Trained servants, skilled laborers, companions suited for various purposes according to your specific requirements and budget considerations. The catalog of available humans was delivered with professional enthusiasm that made Prince Kaelin's stomach clench with revulsion, though his expression remained neutral as he observed offerings that represented systematic reduction of lives to characteristics that served purchaser convenience, rather than acknowledging inherent dignity that should have been protected regardless of circumstances. Most of the displayed individuals bore expressions that ranged from resignation to desperate hope that their next situation might prove better than whatever had led them to this place, while others seemed to have retreated so far into themselves that awareness of external circumstances barely registered through protective numbness that preserved sanity when reality became too painful to process. Completely. But one figure stood apart from the others in ways that caught his attention, despite her obvious efforts to remain invisible among offerings that had been arranged for optimal presentation to potential buyers. The girl with the sack over her head stood motionless at the far end of the display, her stillness so complete it seemed almost supernatural, as if she had learned to exist in spaces between heartbeats where observation couldn't quite reach her. Her bare feet were positioned with precision that spoke of balance and awareness despite the covering that prevented normal vision, while her posture suggested alertness that operated through senses beyond those that relied on sight for gathering information about her surroundings. "That one," Prince Kalen found himself saying, his voice carrying across the space with authority that made the trader immediately attentive to potential transaction that might prove more profitable than his initial assessment had suggested. "Ah," the trader replied with careful neutrality that suggested uncertainty about how to price merchandise, whose characteristics remained deliberately mysterious. "An interesting choice, my lord, though perhaps I should mention certain complications that have affected our ability to establish appropriate market value for her particular circumstances." "Complications," Prince Kalen repeated with tone that encouraged explanation, while his attention remained focused on the figure who seemed to exist in her own sphere of stillness despite the chaos of commercial activity surrounding her position. "She possesses certain qualities that make traditional assessment challenging," the trader continued with diplomatic language that attempted to balance honesty about difficulties with preservation of sale prospects. "Unusual reactions from animals, occasional predictions about natural events that prove accurate but unpredictable, general effect on her environment that some buyers have found. Unsettling. The description suggested characteristics that exceeded normal Omega capabilities while remaining too unreliable or dangerous to be marketed as genuine supernatural services, anomaly that defied categorization according to conventional standards for evaluating human merchandise." "What price?" Prince Kalen asked, though something in his chest suggested that monetary considerations were becoming secondary to recognition that operated beyond conscious calculation, to honor instincts that had been shaped by royal training in assessment of value that transcended immediate utility. "2 coins, the trader replied with tone that carried embarrassment about pricing that seemed inadequate for human life, while reflecting genuine uncertainty about merchandise whose worth remained impossible to determine through standard evaluation methods. 2 coins. The amount was so small, it felt like insult to dignity, rather than serious assessment of value, suggesting either complete dismissal of her worth or desperate desire to transfer responsibility for her care to someone else, before complications manifested in ways that could affect business reputation or personal safety. Prince Kalen reached for the coins without conscious decision, movements guided by impulses that bypassed rational analysis to serve purposes he couldn't articulate, but felt compelled to honor despite inability to explain motivations that seemed to operate beyond normal considerations about charitable obligation or practical utility. "Sold," he said simply, extending payment that would transfer ownership according to laws that reduced human dignity to property status, while his heart suggested that forces deeper than legal transaction were determining outcomes that would prove significant beyond anything monetary exchange could encompass. The trader accepted coins with relief that spoke of genuine pleasure at completing sale that had been complicated by characteristics he clearly didn't understand, while his expression carried gratitude that suggested transfer of difficult merchandise to buyer whose purposes remained unclear, but whose ability to handle unusual circumstances exceeded his own experience or comfort level. "She comes with no guarantees," the trader warned with careful disclaimer that attempted to protect his reputation if complications arose after ownership had been legally transferred, "and no documentation about background or abilities that might affect your plans for her utilization or management." "Understood," Prince Kalen replied with patience that reflected years of training in diplomatic protocols that required accepting incomplete information while making decisions that could affect outcomes far beyond immediate circumstances. He approached the girl who now belonged to him according to laws that governed property transfer, though something deeper than legal ownership suggested that their connection operated according to principles that transcended monetary transaction, to honor bonds that had been waiting years for appropriate recognition. "Come," he said quietly, extending his hand toward someone whose face remained hidden beneath covering that prevented assessment of reactions, while his proximity revealed scent that spoke of moonlight and wild places, essence that made his wolf stir with recognition that felt both foreign and somehow inevitable. She turned toward his voice with movements that displayed grace despite her circumstances, accepting his guidance with trust that seemed disproportionate to their brief interaction, while her presence created sensations of rightness that challenged his understanding of appropriate relationships between royalty and property, acquired through marketplace transaction. As they moved away from stalls where human dignity was reduced to commodity status, Prince Kalen found himself aware of a tension that followed their departure. Not the casual interest that marked ordinary commercial exchange, but focused observation that suggested their transaction had been noted by those whose purposes remained unclear, but whose intensity implied significance that exceeded simpy. The curiosity about unusual purchase by customer whose identity remained unknown. The girl, his property now, according to laws that made him responsible for her welfare, while granting him authority to determine her future, according to his convenience and purposes, walked beside him with quiet dignity that challenged assumptions about what slavery was supposed to look like, what ownership was supposed to feel like, what responsibility was supposed to encompass when applied to beings whose worth exceeded anything monetary assessment could measure. "What's your name?" he asked as they reached the market's edge where ordinary commerce gave way to residential areas where his presence would be less likely to attract attention that might complicate circumstances he was only beginning to understand. She turned toward his voice, but remained silent, though her posture suggested attention rather than defiance, awareness rather than withdrawal from interaction, that represented the first direct communication attempt since ownership had been established through legal transfer of financial consideration. "Can you speak?" he continued gently, recognizing that silence might reflect physical limitation rather than choice to avoid communication with new owner, whose intentions remained unknown, despite generosity that had removed her from circumstances that had reduced her value to 2 coins. A slight nod beneath the sack suggested that speech was possible, but currently withheld for reasons that might become clear through time and circumstances that allowed trust to develop between them, understanding that transcended master-servant relationship to acknowledge shared humanity, despite legal status that defined her as property subject to his authority. "Then speak when you're ready," he said with patience that reflected understanding about trauma that might require healing before normal communication became possible, while his royal training and leadership provided insights about people whose circumstances had required them to develop survival mechanisms that included strategic silence and careful observation of new situations. They walked through streets that led toward the palace district, where his residence would provide security and privacy necessary for determining how to integrate someone whose characteristics remained mysterious into household systems that had been designed to accommodate conventional servants whose capabilities could be assessed through normal evaluation methods. But as they moved through spaces where his authority was absolute, and her status was defined by legal documents that reduced her to property, Prince Kalen found himself increasingly aware that forces beyond marketplace transaction were shaping outcomes that would challenge his understanding of ownership, responsibility, and the mysterious ways that destiny operated when mortal plans intersected. With divine will that honored purposes deeper than political convenience or social convention. Behind them, traders resumed ordinary business, while observers melted back into crowd patterns that suggested their interest had been satisfied or redirected toward other concerns, leaving no obvious indication that anything significant had occurred during transaction that had transferred ownership of someone whose worth would prove to exceed anything 2 coins could possibly represent. The girl who had been purchased for the price of a meal was about to discover that royal household offered opportunities for recognition that marketplace assessment had failed to provide, while Prince Kalen was about to learn that sometimes the most profound investments were those that seemed least valuable according to conventional standards for measuring worth, potential, and the kind of significance that operated according to divine mathematics rather than human calculation. 2 coins had purchased more than either of them understood, initiating transformation that would challenge their kingdom's assumptions about value, recognition, and the mysterious ways that fate revealed itself to those wise enough to look beyond surface appearances to underlying truth that waited for appropriate circumstances to manifest in service of purposes greater than individual comfort or social convenience. The palace corridors that led to Prince Kalen's private quarters seemed to stretch endlessly before them, vast hallways lined with portraits of ancestors, whose painted eyes appeared to track their progress with expressions that ranged from curiosity to judgment about the unconventional addition to royal household staff. Elowen moved beside him with footsteps so quiet they barely echoed off marble floors that had been polished to mirror brightness, her presence somehow managing to be both substantial and ethereal, in ways that challenged normal understanding of how space and attention operated around individuals. "The household staff will provide you with appropriate quarters," Prince Kalen said, as they approached chambers that had been designed to accommodate servants, whose duties required proximity to royal presence, without compromising security or privacy that governed life within palace walls. Basic necessities, work assignments suited to your capabilities, treatment that honors dignity regardless of legal status. The words carried weight of royal decree that would establish standards for her integration into systems that had been developed over generations to manage complex relationships between authority and service, privilege and responsibility, individual worth and collective function that kept palace operations running smoothly, despite competing demands and personalities. But even as he spoke, Prince Kaelin found himself struggling to categorize exactly what roles someone with her mysterious characteristics would fulfill within household hierarchies that had been designed around conventional understanding of servant capabilities and limitations. The trader's warnings about unusual qualities suggested that traditional domestic assignments might prove inadequate or inappropriate for abilities that exceeded normal parameters for evaluation. They were met at the servants' entrance by Margareta Stoneheart, head of household staff, whose 30 years of experience managing palace operations had prepared her for most situations that arose when royal preferences intersected with practical necessities of maintaining complex domestic systems that served both ceremonial and personal functions according to standards that reflected crown deg. "Knighty. Your Highness," Margareta said with professional courtesy that managed to combine respect for royal authority with subtle inquiry about circumstances that appeared to deviate from normal protocols for staff acquisition. "I understand we have a new addition to our household. May I ask about her background and qualifications for available positions?" "Limited documentation," Prince Kaelin replied diplomatically, gesturing toward the figure whose covered head prevented normal assessment of characteristics that would typically guide assignment decisions. "But circumstances suggest capabilities that may prove valuable once properly evaluated and appropriately directed." Margareta's experienced eye took in details that would inform her recommendations about placement and supervision. The girl's posture spoke of awareness and intelligence despite obvious distress. Her clothing suggested recent hardship but underlying quality that indicated better circumstances in her past. Most notably, her stillness carried authority that seemed inappropriate for someone whose Gal status defined her as property recently acquired through marketplace transaction. "Very well, Your Highness," Margareta said with efficiency that characterized those whose responsibilities required adapting to royal decisions regardless of personal opinions about their practical wisdom. "We shall begin with basic orientation and assessment, then determine appropriate duties based on capabilities and household needs." But before arrangements could be finalized, the girl made a sound, not quite speech, more like whisper that carried meaning despite its indistinct nature, and suddenly every horse in the royal stables began calling in harmony that had nothing to do with feeding time or normal behavioral patterns. The voices of dozens of animals rose in chorus that seemed to acknowledge presence rather than distress, recognition rather than alarm, as if her proximity had awakened awareness that operated according to principles beyond their normal sensory processing. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, carrying tones that spoke of ancient connections between human consciousness and natural forces that governed spiritual architecture of their world. "Interesting," Prince Kaelin murmured with tone that suggested professional fascination, rather than concern about unusual phenomena that were beginning to manifest in response to her presence within palace walls. Perhaps conventional domestic assignments would prove inadequate for someone whose effects extend beyond traditional servant capabilities. Margareta's expression revealed growing comprehension that their new household member represented challenges that exceeded her experience with managing diverse staff personalities and capabilities, requiring adaptations that might affect established routines and protocols that had governed palace operations according to tested methods and predictable outcomes. "The East Wing contains quarters that might provide more appropriate accommodation," she suggested with diplomatic language that attempted to balance practical considerations with respect for royal decisions that operated beyond her authority to approve or modify. "Private chambers with access to gardens where unusual characteristics might manifest without affecting general household functions. Private chambers, rather than shared servant accommodations. Access to spaces that would allow whatever made her different to express itself without creating complications for staff members, whose duties required predictable working conditions and normal environmental stability." As they made their way toward the East Wing, palace staff they encountered showed varying degrees of reaction to the girl's presence. Some paused in their duties with expressions that suggested they could sense something unusual without being able to identify its source. Others seemed drawn to approach before catching themselves and returning to their tasks with confused expressions that indicated their instincts had been activated by stimuli they couldn't consciously identify or understand. The chambers that Margareta had suggested proved to be spacious and comfortable, appointed with furniture that spoke of quality while maintaining simplicity appropriate for someone whose social position required careful balance between dignity and recognition of legal status that defined her as property subject to royal authority. Food will be provided according to standard household schedules, Margareta explained with professional efficiency that attempted to establish routines despite unusual circumstances, though dietary requirements or preferences can be accommodated within reasonable parameters if they become relevant to health or performance considerations. And the covering? Prince Kalen asked, his attention focused on the sack that continued to conceal features that traders had suggested might prove problematic. For various reasons they had preferred not to specify in detail. Perhaps, Margareta suggested with careful diplomacy, privacy might allow for assessments that would inform appropriate assignment decisions while maintaining discretion about characteristics that may require sensitive handling. The suggestion carried implications about reveal that would occur without audience, evaluation that would determine her capabilities and limitations through observation rather than assumption, based on marketplace descriptions that might prove inaccurate or incomplete. "Leave us," Prince Kalen instructed with authority that brooked no argument, despite Margareta's obvious concern about protocols that typically required supervisory presence during initial assessments of new staff members whose backgrounds remained largely unknown. When they were alone in chambers that provided both comfort and security, Prince Kalen found himself hesitating before taking action that would irreversibly change their interaction by revealing whatever lay beneath covering that had been designed to prevent exactly this kind of direct assessment. "I'm going to remove the sack," he said quietly, giving her opportunity to indicate objection or preference about circumstances that would affect how revelation occurred, whether she felt ready for exposure that would determine his reaction and subsequent treatment of her within household systems that reflected his judgment about her worth and capabilities. She remained still as he approached, neither resisting nor encouraging action that would end mystery that had surrounded her identity since their first encounter, though her breathing suggested awareness that this moment would determine outcomes that extended far beyond simple assessment of physical appearance. When the rough burlap finally lifted away from her head, Prince Kalen found himself staring into features that challenged every assumption he had made about marketplace assessments and trader evaluations. Silver hair that caught light like captured moonbeams framed a face of ethereal beauty that seemed to glow with inner radiance, while eyes of violet so deep they appeared almost black-held depths that spoke of wisdom beyond her apparent years and experiences that had shaped understanding, far exceeding anything her circumstances should have provided. But more striking than beauty, that would have commanded attention in any setting, was the sense of power that emanated from her presence like heat from forge, authority that made his royal wolf acknowledge superiority that operated according to principles beyond political hierarchy or inherited status. "You're not what they said you were," he whispered, with growing comprehension that marketplace traders had systematically misrepresented her value through either ignorance about her true characteristics or deliberate deception designed to transfer responsibility for managing capabilities that exceeded their understanding or comfort level. "No, Your Highness," she replied in voice that carried tones of silver bells and distant thunder, sound that resonated through his consciousness with recognition that felt both immediate and somehow inevitable. "I am not." Her speech revealed education and refinement that contradicted every assumption about background that had led to her presence in slave markets, while her manner of address suggested knowledge about royal protocol that implied familiarity with court systems and ceremonial procedures that ordinary servants would never have encountered. "What are you?" he asked with fascination that exceeded mere curiosity, to touch on recognition that forces beyond his understanding were manifesting through circumstances that had brought them together, according to patterns that challenged rational explanation. "I am what your kingdom has forgotten how to recognize," she said with quiet dignity that commanded respect, despite legal status that defined her as property subject to his authority. "Lunaborn, chosen by moon forces that govern spiritual architecture of your realm, bound by destiny rather than marketplace transaction to serve purposes that transcend individual comfort or political convenience. Lunaborn." The term carried implications that challenged everything he understood about divine authority and its relationship to earthly governance, suggesting connections to powers that operated beyond royal inheritance, to honor selections that served cosmic balance rather than human preference about appropriate leadership and succession. Outside their windows, the moon appeared despite broad daylight, its silver disk visible against blue sky, in violation of natural patterns that governed celestial display, acknowledgement that forces beyond ordinary understanding were confirming recognition that had been delayed too long by circumstances that had hidden truth beneath appearances designed to prevent its discovery. The girl he had purchased for 2 coins was about to transform his understanding of worth, recognition, and the mysterious ways that divine will operated when mortal plans intersected with cosmic purpose that honored qualities deeper than bloodline or inherited privilege to serve destinies that had been written before their births, in languages only the heart could read properly. Luna had claimed her champion, and their kingdom was about to discover that sometimes the most precious gifts came disguised as marketplace refuse, waiting for wisdom sufficient to recognize what others had been too limited to see or appreciate, according to standards that transcended monetary assessment, to honor divine mathematics that calculated worth according to principles beyond human understanding. The revelation of her true identity had transformed the chamber from simple servant quarters into something that felt almost sacred, charged with energy that made the very air seem to shimmer with recognition of forces that operated beyond ordinary understanding. Prince Kalen found himself struggling to process the magnitude of what he was witnessing, not just the physical transformation that had revealed beauty beyond imagination, but the spiritual authority that emanated from someone whose presence challenged every assumption about power, bloodline, and divine selection. "Luna born," he repeated, with tone that mixed awe with growing comprehension of implications that extended far beyond individual circumstances, to encompass kingdom-wide consequences that would affect succession, governance, and the very foundation of royal authority that he had been trained to inherit and exercise. "The last of my line," Elowin confirmed with sadness, that spoke of losses that had shaped her understanding of isolation and survival through circumstances that had systematically eliminated others who shared her sacred heritage, hidden since childhood to prevent recognition that would have resulted in execution by those who feared what we represented to established power structures. The confession revealed systematic persecution that had reduced Luna-born bloodlines to near extinction through policies that prioritized political stability over spiritual balance, eliminating those whose authority transcended inherited privilege to serve cosmic purposes that couldn't be controlled or influenced through conventional means. "My family were slaughtered when I was 7, she continued with quiet dignity that spoke of trauma that had been processed through years of meditation and acceptance, rather than allowed to fester into bitterness or desire for revenge. I survived by learning to hide what I was, to suppress abilities that would have marked me for death if they had been recognized by those who served systems that valued political convenience over divine truth." Prince Kalen felt his worldview shifting as he processed information that challenged fundamental assumptions about his kingdom's history, about the methods that had been used to establish and maintain royal authority, about the spiritual cost of policies that had prioritized immediate stability over long-term balance between earthly governance and cosmic will. "The traders who sold you," he asked with growing suspicion about circumstances that had brought her to marketplace where her value had been deliberately misrepresented, "did they know what you were?" "Some suspected," she admitted with expression that revealed complex understanding of motivations that had shaped her treatment by those whose purposes ranged from profit to fear to genuine ignorance about characteristics that exceeded their ability to comprehend or manage. But most were content to accept surface explanations that allowed them to profit from mystery without investigating truth that might have proven dangerous or inconvenient. The systematic devaluation had been protection disguised as abuse, strategy that preserved her life through deliberate reduction of apparent worth, while she waited for circumstances that would allow safe revelation of identity that carried both tremendous power and equally tremendous vulnerability to those who would see her existence as threat rather than blessing. "The abilities they mentioned," Prince Kalen said, as understanding dawned about phenomena that had been described as unsettling complications, rather than manifestations of divine favor, animal reactions, weather predictions, general effects on environment, all evidence of Luna heritage operating despite your efforts to suppress recognition. Suppression was never complete, she confirmed with small smile that transformed her features from ethereal beauty to something approaching divine radiance. The moon calls to her children regardless of circumstances, and power that serves cosmic balance cannot be permanently contained by fear or political necessity. As if responding to her words, the moonlight that had appeared during broad daylight began streaming through their windows with intensity that should have been impossible given celestial mechanics, bathing the chamber in silver radiance that made everything seem touched by forces that operated according to rules beyond normal natural laws. But more significantly, Prince Kalen could feel something stirring within his own consciousness, recognition that operated beyond rational thought, to honor instincts that had been shaped by a royal bloodline that carried its own connections to divine authority, awareness that their meeting had been orchestrated by powers that served purposes transcending individual choice or circumstance. The bond, he whispered with growing comprehension of forces that were manifesting between them, despite legal relationship that defined her as property rather than equal partner. This isn't about ownership or service arrangements, is it? Divine bonds, she said gently, extending her hand toward him with gesture that transformed request into honor, while her violet eyes held warmth that spoke of recognition rather than submission. Operate according to principles that transcend legal documentation or social hierarchy, to honor connections that serve cosmic balance, through partnerships that neither party can consciously choose or eject. When their skin touched, the chamber filled with light that had nothing to do with conventional illumination and everything to do with acknowledgement that challenged assumptions about chance and choice in matters that governed spiritual architecture of their realm. Ancient symbols appeared in the air around them, burning scripts that wrote themselves in languages older than recorded history, marking recognition of bonds that had been waiting decades for appropriate moment to reveal connections that honored divine purpose rather than human preference. The sensation was overwhelming, not just physical attraction, though that was certainly present, but spiritual recognition that felt like coming home to places he had never been, finding completion in partnership with someone whose existence had been unknown until this moment, but whose presence now seemed essential for purposes he was only beginning to understand. Luna and King, she breathed, as the light gradually subsided to levels that allowed normal vision, while its warmth continued to flow between them with intensity that spoke of permanent connection rather than temporary magical display, bound not by law or custom, but by cosmic will that honors balance between earthly governance and spiritual authority. The implications were staggering. If she was truly Lunaborn, if their bond carried divine sanction, then everything about succession, royal authority, and kingdom governance would need to be reconsidered according to principles that had been forgotten or deliberately suppressed during generations of purely political rule that had ignored spiritual foundations of legitimate power. "My father," Prince Kalen said with growing concern about revelations that would challenge established order in ways that could destabilize their entire realm. The current king whose authority governs succession patterns and legal framework that defines royal power. How will he react to discoveries that challenge fundamental assumptions about divine selection and appropriate leadership? "Your father's authority," Elowen replied with certainty that carried weight of prophetic knowledge rather than simple opinion, "was always meant to be transitional, maintaining stability until cosmic balance could be restored through recognition that had been delayed by circumstances beyond mortal control, but never abandoned by forces that govern divine purpose." Before Prince Kalen could fully process the implications of her statement, urgent knocking at their chamber door interrupted contemplation that had been reshaping his understanding of destiny, responsibility, and the mysterious ways that divine will operated when earthly plans intersected with cosmic necessity. "Your Highness," Margaretta's voice carried anxiety that spoke of developments requiring immediate royal attention. "Urgent message from the royal physician. His Majesty's condition has taken sudden turn that requires your immediate presence." Froom? The timing felt too precise to be coincidental, as if forces that had orchestrated their recognition were also preparing circumstances that would accelerate transformation, already set in motion, by bonds that transcended individual choice, to serve purposes greater than personal comfort or political convenience. "Go," Elowen said, with understanding that honored duty, even when it required separation, during moments that should have been reserved for processing changes that would affect every aspect of their existence. The kingdom needs its future king, and divine timing operates according to patterns that serve cosmic balance rather than individual preference for convenient revelation. As Prince Kalen prepared to answer summons that might herald the beginning of succession that would test everything they had just discovered about divine bonds and cosmic authority, he found himself caught between duty that had been shaped by conventional understanding of royal responsibility and recognition that their partnership represented forces that operated beyond ordinary governance to serve purposes that challenged every assumption about power and its proper exercise. The girl purchased for 2 coins was about to become Luna, whose authority would transform their kingdom's understanding of divine selection, spiritual balance, and the mysterious ways that cosmic will manifested through bonds that honored truth rather than convenience, purpose rather than preference, destiny that had been waiting centuries for appropriate recognition to serve balance that transcend indeed individual circumstances to honor forces greater than earthly understanding could encompass. Behind them, moonlight continued to stream through windows despite broad daylight, acknowledgement that cosmic authority had entered their realm to restore balance that had been disrupted too long by governance that ignored spiritual foundations in favor of political expediency, that served immediate convenience rather than eternal purpose, that operated according to divine mathematics beyond human calculation or control. The transformation was only beginning, but already the very foundations of their kingdom were shifting to accommodate truth that would challenge everyone's comfortable assumptions about power, recognition, and the sacred responsibilities that came with authority, blessed by forces that served cosmic balance, rather than individual ambition or inherited privilege. 1 year later, the coronation of Luna Elowen had transformed the kingdom's understanding of divine authority from political convenience into demonstrated spiritual reality, challenging every assumption about power and bloodline that had governed royal succession for generations. The ceremony itself had been witnessed by representatives from allied realms, all gathering to observe the unprecedented elevation of someone who had been systematically hidden until cosmic timing revealed worth that exceeded anything monetary assessment could measure. Now, as spring brought renewal to palace gardens that bloomed with unprecedented vitality, Queen Elowen stood beside King Kalen on the balcony of chambers that had become sanctuary for bonds that transcended earthly governance to serve cosmic balance through partnership that honored both spiritual authority and practical wisdom necessary for effective leadership. Below in the courtyard, former slaves who had been liberated through royal decrees that eliminated human trafficking worked alongside nobles in service roles that valued contribution over bloodline, demonstration that worth existed independent of circumstances that had previously been used to justify systematic exploitation and dehumanization of those whose legal status had reduced them to property. The marketplace that had once traded in human dignity had been transformed into educational centers, where rescued individuals received training and skills that would allow them to rebuild lives that honored their inherent worth, rather than circumstances that had temporarily reduced their value to whatever desperate people were willing to pay for ownership of beings whose true worth exceeded any monetary calculation. The harvest reports are showing remarkable improvements throughout the kingdom, King Kalen observed, reviewing documents that tracked changes in agricultural production, community welfare, and spiritual satisfaction among populations that had learned to recognize divine authority in forms that challenged conventional expectations about appropriate leadership and social organization. Improvements that had manifested following restoration of cosmic balance through recognition of Luna-born authority that had been systematically suppressed during generations of purely political governance that had ignored spiritual foundations necessary for sustainable prosperity and genuine community welfare. The moon's blessing extends to all who honor divine purpose, Elowen replied with certainty that spoke of understanding cosmic forces that operated beyond human control, while manifesting through earthly systems that served spiritual balance rather than individual advancement or political convenience. Throughout the kingdom, communities were discovering what became possible when governance honored both practical necessities and spiritual principles, when authority served divine purpose rather than demanding submission through fear or force, when recognition elevated those who had been dismissed despite possessing worth that transcended conventional understanding of value and contribution. "Any word from the border territories about implementation of the new laws?" she asked, though 6 months of reports had suggested that most regions embraced reforms that prioritized spiritual balance over the kind of systematic exploitation that had nearly destroyed Luna-born bloodlines through policies designed to eliminate divine authority that operated beyond political control. "Universal acceptance," he confirmed with something that might have been amazement at the speed with which transformation had occurred once cosmic balance was restored through appropriate recognition of divine selection. Even territories that initially resisted changes are requesting guidance about establishing spiritual governance that honors both earthly necessities and cosmic principles. The transformation had been as profound as it had been necessary, challenging assumptions that had governed their realm for generations, while establishing new standards that served eternal purposes rather than immediate convenience or inherited privilege that required no personal merit to maintain. As evening settled over the palace grounds, bringing traditional ceremonies that honored both individual achievement and collective progress toward spiritual balance, Queen Elowen found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her from marketplace commodity to divine authority that served cosmic purpose through earthly governance. The systematic devaluation that had reduced her worth to 2 coins had been protection disguised as abuse, strategy that preserved her life, while forces beyond mortal understanding orchestrated circumstances that would eventually allow safe revelation of identity that carried both tremendous power and equally tremendous responsibility for serving purposes greater than personal comfort. But perhaps most importantly, her elevation had proven that divine selection operated according to principles deeper than bloodline or inherited status, that spiritual authority could be found in places where others saw only discarded refuse, that cosmic balance honored qualities that transcended conventional understanding of appropriate leadership and worthy service. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had walked past that market stall?" King Kaelin asked as they observed evening activities that celebrated transformed kingdom where spiritual and earthly authority operated in harmony rather than conflict. "Divine timing," she replied with confidence that spoke of understanding forces that operated beyond individual choice to honor patterns that served cosmic balance through methods that challenged human assumptions about chance and coincidence, operates according to principles that ensure appropriate recognition, regardless of apparent circumstances or personal decisions that seem to determine outcomes, even when those decisions seemed motivated by simple impulse rather than conscious recognition of divine purpose, he pressed, still amazed by the precision with which cosmic forces had orchestrated their meeting, despite his complete ignorance about spiritual significance of choices that had felt spontaneous rather than guided. "Especially then," she confirmed with gentle amusement, that spoke of understanding mysteries that exceeded mortal comprehension, while manifesting through earthly events that seemed to operate according to normal cause and effect, until their deeper purposes were revealed through outcomes that served eternal rather than temporary purposes. Throughout the territories that stretched beyond horizon, communities continued to discover what became possible when governance honored both practical wisdom and spiritual truth, when authority served cosmic balance rather than individual ambition, when recognition elevated those who had been dismissed despite possessing divine worth that transcended ordinary understanding of value and contribute. Ion. The kingdom had learned that sometimes the most precious discoveries occurred not through dramatic announcements, but through quiet recognition of truth that had always existed beneath surface appearances, waiting for wisdom sufficient to see beyond limitation to divine possibility that honored what others had failed to value appropriately. King Kaelin had paid 2 coins for a girl with a sack over her head, never knowing that he was purchasing not property, but partnership with Luna herself, not servant, but queen whose authority would transform their realm's understanding of power, recognition, and the sacred balance between earthly governance and cosmic will that served purposes greater than individual comfort or political convenience. NC. The transaction had been completion of destiny rather than marketplace exchange, restoration of cosmic balance that had been disrupted too long by governance that ignored spiritual foundations in favor of political expediency, that served immediate convenience rather than eternal purpose, that operated according to divine mathematics beyond human calculation. Their kingdom now stood as demonstration that worth could not be determined by circumstances or social status, that divine authority manifested in forms that challenged conventional expectations, that sometimes the most profound transformations began with recognition that what appeared worthless actually possessed value beyond anything monetary assessment could measure, or worldly authority could. Properly acknowledged, 2 coins had purchased a kingdom's redemption, proof that cosmic justice operated through methods that honored truth rather than convenience, destiny rather than circumstance, divine purpose that transcended human understanding to serve balance that would endure long after individual lives had contributed their parts to eternal patterns that governed spiritual architecture of existence itself. If you enjoyed this story, a like or comment really helps, and if you wish to hear more tales like this one, make sure you subscribe so you never miss the next tale.